Thank you, Jace. Thank you. Thank you guys for being here today. It's good to see y'all. I'm going to sit down like this is some sort of poetry jam session here. Just my beautiful love letter to the University of St. Mary of the Lake in Mundelein, a 114-page thesis, which I distill into this presentation right here for you all, for you. Who's excited? That's right. A whole year of my life dedicated to writing this thing. And it's also actually an opportunity for me, as I was telling Jace and some others, to give this presentation as sort of a dry run, because I also have to give this paper presentation next week at the Society for Catholic Liturgy Conference in Houston. So you are getting sort of a sneak peek of something here. So if you don't think you get your money's worth at Theology on Tap, you're wrong. You're wrong. As Jace said, I've been a priest now for 5 years, in priestly ministry for 5 years. It's a different story. Maybe that's a different Theology on Tap. And I've been at Ponca City. I've been in Oklahoma City at Epiphany, and now I'm at Holy Trinity in Okarche, which has been a great assignment. I love Holy Trinity. For those of you who don't know, but I'm sure most of you do, Holy Trinity is the home parish of Blessed Stanley Rother, right? Our own Oklahoma priest, missionary, martyr. So let's give it up for Stanley Rother, his witness, right? And his intercession for us. And it's a beautiful church. I mean, if any of you have been there, you know that. It's a beautiful church. And so I'm inspired and honored to be there serving as pastor. And then, of course, I do work on the Archdiocese as well. So Jace is telling me to speak more into the mic so that everyone can hear me clearly. Is that better? Yeah. Is that better? Okay. What was I going to say? Oh, one of the other things that Jace mentioned as working in the Office of Worship, Secretariat for Divine Worship, is that I also I serve on our building committee for the Archdiocese. So any buildings actually at all that are built on church properties around the Archdiocese, they pass through my eyes and our building committee's eyes. But especially, of course, building churches or renovating churches. So that's a little bit where my experience, the rubber hits the road, as it were, in this stuff. But my presentation, this thesis and this topic for our presentation, our consideration this evening is entitled Imagination and 20th Century Catholic Church Architecture. So I'm sure a lot of you can think of churches that you've been at, and you kind of walk into the church, or even you walk outside of the church, and you think, is this a church? This looks like a blank. What could you fill in that blank with?
Nursing home.
Okay, nursing home, office building, that's good. Other ones? Pizza Hut, a gym, yeah, warehouse, all sorts of things. And it wasn't until maybe I came here, or I just had more experience with churches that I had that question. I'm like, this doesn't look like a church. Why doesn't this look like a church? And why do we build churches that didn't seem to really look like churches? And so I embarked on this whole study, right, of 20th century church architecture. It seemed to be that's where the problems were stemming from. And I came up with some good results. So we're going to dive right into it. And we start with famous American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who defines architecture as the triumph of human imagination over materials, methods, and men, to put man into possession of his own earth. So if you think about Frank Lloyd Wright, he's definitely earliest 20th century, more of like a humanist tradition, so not very religious in his own outlook on life. And for Wright, architecture has the power to connect man with the world in which he lives. He believed that architecture should be suited to its environment and be a product of its place, its purpose, and its time in order to successfully accomplish its mission. And so his works, which you see scrolling across there, are a testament to his architectural vision. Falling Water there on the left, and then that's his home in Oak Park, Illinois, which I've toured too many times to count in my many travels to Chicago. So, to steal this insight, though, of Frank Lloyd Wright, a beautiful definition of architecture, I think we can baptize it, right? We can make it Catholic, like we do with almost every good thing. And we might describe the connection between architecture and the human imagination thus. Instead of the word triumph, we might use the word inspiration, because we believe that sacred art must be inspired. Instead of talking about materials and methods and men, we might say sacred signs and symbols and spaces, which describe the church building and how it serves the liturgy. And instead of putting man into possession of his own earth, we might talk about how the church architect wants to seeks to put man in possession of his eternal home, which is heaven. This is our inheritance as Christians, and so it points to the eschatological glory that Christ has won for us on the cross. So if we talk about then architecture with this Christian imagination, we revise it, we get a definition that looks like this. Church architecture is the inspiration of the human imagination over sacred signs, symbols, and spaces to put man into possession of his eternal home, which is heaven. And this is the goal of church architects since the Edict of Milan, right? Since Christians were brought out of their homes into the public. And so throughout the centuries, it's accomplished this vision in many different arrangements. Now, throughout really the centuries, though, the church hasn't said much about church architecture, officially speaking, right? It's just kind of a tradition handed down. It doesn't codify much about the furnishings of the church, but we do all have in our minds some idea of what a church should look like. And that's why you had those thoughts when you go into churches that don't look like churches. This looks like a nursing home. This looks like a community college. This looks like a Pizza Hut. In the 20th century, witnessed, though, great shifts in liturgical and architectural principles, which resulted in this wide spectrum of church buildings, many of which mark a sharp departure from what had been ingrained, right, in our Catholic imagination. So we're going to examine 3 periods within the 20th century and the authorship which expresses liturgical and architectural reform. And we'll seek to answer that question, kind of a question that circumscribes our whole study here. Did an increase in more imaginative church designs indicate a stronger liturgical imagination? So we begin with the American liturgical movement and 2 thinkers. Here we have Virgil Michael, who was one of the founders in the United States of the liturgical movement, this period of time in the early 20th century where there was a rediscovery of the liturgy, right, which are the rites of the church, what the church believes and prays through its beliefs, and how that should transform our lives. Just note, liturgical movement does not designate liturgical dance. That's a different thing. It's not liturgical. It's not the liturgical movement. But today, as we look at the liturgical movement, we look especially at Virgil Michael, who was one of the first leaders of the liturgical movement. He was from St. John's in Collegeville, Minnesota. And in fact, I failed to mention St. John's was the church that was in this slide, St. John's, Collegeville, Minnesota, which in many ways is a quintessential 20th century product of this whole reform in church architecture. So we have Virgil Michael here. He says, Catholic churches as works of the architect's art must pursue religious perfection as expressed in Catholic ideals or worship. Architecture is truly a sermon in stones. Wow, that's beautiful, right? And really that was the idea of the liturgical movement, really this purification of what architecture, of what the liturgy could be, liturgical music, and the liturgical rites. Inviting, as we understand the 20th century, to be really interested in liturgy in active participation. And another thinker, who is not necessarily a liturgical movement thinker, but early 20th century philosopher, Jacques Maritain, he says, the intelligence delights in the beautiful because in the beautiful it finds itself again and recognizes itself and makes contact with its own light. He highlights three essential elements for sacred art. Orthodoxy, that art is conformed to doctrinal truths that we believe about the faith. Another essential element is liturgy, that it's conforming to liturgical usage. And inspiration, it's inspired and ordered towards true and authentic religious means. And so these three elements together make something intelligible, legible in terms of its sacred art. Right? It reveals what is beautiful. And so kind of a corollary idea that Maritain comes up with, and this is a very important idea that sticks with all these liturgical movement thinkers, and they all repeat over and over and over again. Because we talk about beauty and what sacred art is supposed to do, it necessarily means that a work of sacred art demands no particular style. No particular style. Because the dominant trend was for the dominance of a particular style. On the right here, we see a particular style. Anybody know what kind of style of architecture this is? On the right? Gothic, that's right. This is Gothic architecture, which became very popular again in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it became so dominant that it did seem that really if you wanted to build a church, it needed to be in a Gothic style, especially if it was going to be the best. At a different era in Catholic history, we had the predominance of the style on the left. Does anybody know what that style would be described as? Baroque, yeah, exactly. So we have Baroque style and Gothic style. There are two very dominant popular styles in Catholic church architecture. But Maritain and all the 20th century church, all the liturgical movement thinkers made this bold claim that the work of sacred art demands no particular style. Again, we said in the 20th century there was a dominance of this Gothic style, really a neo-Gothic style. It was influenced by a particular architect who is Augustus Welby Pugin. You see a picture of him there. And you get perfect examples of this in Oklahoma, for example. As you see in this presentation, I cater it to our audience here, our beautiful Oklahoma audience. I, as I said before, Texan by birth, but Okie by grace, am here, and I draw from what we have here. So, perfect example of this early 20th century neo-Gothic style would be St. Francis Xavier in Enid. That's right. Casey knows. Casey's from there. Casey knows. That's right. St. Francis Xavier and Enid. So you got Gothic arches. It doesn't quite have as many columns as Holy Trinity and Okarche, for example. But it does have a lot going on there. A lot of those Gothic arches and everything like that. Very neo-Gothic style. And it became very popular. So you get that. And this is all what the liturgical movement is trying to kind of break away from. So it moves towards more simplified but still noble styles. Here's a liturgical movement drawing, right? These are the drawings that they would draw at this time about what a church should look like. And you see here kind of a simple, it gives a lot of focus to the tabernacle, the altar. It's really emphasized or it's given emphasis by a baldachin, which is that thing. It's like a ciborium. A baldachin is the kind of thing that goes over the altar on the right there. Or on the left, what just hangs over is called a tester. So you have a tester over the altar, a baldachin over the altar. You have the prominence of the cross, 6 candlesticks, and a tabernacle leading to the altar. We have a perfect example of this in Oklahoma City at our beautiful, St. Francis. Actually, St. Francis would have been a really good picture. Why didn't you make this PowerPoint? I'm sorry. St. Francis would have been good. I was thinking of where I go to work some days a week, the Catholic Pastoral Center, which is a little bit later, but a very kind of simplified style of that. St. Francis would have been actually a really good one. I'm regretting now of my choice. In pictures, thank you. Thank you. We'll just switch it right now. No, I'm just kidding. So this is what the liturgical movement was moving towards. And one of the big authors, specifically about architecture, was this guy, H.A. Reinhold. He was a German-born but American priest who lived in Washington. He ended up in Washington in the Diocese of what's now Yakima, so in south central Washington. And he wrote a lot about liturgical architecture. And one of his big things was building the liturgical church. We must have two foci, baptism and Eucharist, remembering that one is initiation, the other is the full earthly attainment, anticipation of glory. We can see that they are opposites but related to one another as the beginning and the end. The idea that the liturgical church is a church that simply puts first things first, as he says. And what does that mean? First things first. Well, the first thing is really the altar and the baptistry, as he says, the baptismal font. And so he kind of comes up with this whole scheme of a plan which really, in arranging a church, would emphasize these things. He's very proud of this arrangement whereby you enter in the sides of a church, and one way you look and you see the baptismal font and the baptistry, and the other way you look and you see the altar. And there's a clear directionality, a very strong sense of pilgrimage from baptism to the altar as one walks in their journey of life. Now, one of the problems with Reinhold's whole theory, which is nonetheless very good and informative for the church, is that it seems to lack a consideration of beauty, right? So he builds a church, as we see here, St. Joseph and Sunnyside. It's hard to tell. The church is kind of behind the floor plan there, but it's just a big square block. It's boring. And he argues that a building must communicate the message that all beauty is within. Right? It's contained within the church. The order of the dedication of a church is made up of rites, which indicate that the church is like a person, and thus it should look like an organic, spiritualized growth. But the altar is Christ. So this early shift articulates, how imagination should be expressed in liturgical altar architecture. There should be a real emphasis on what happens inside the church, and we shouldn't really focus at all on styles or exterior beauty, or even really the finer details about kind of historical figures or historical forms, like the Gothic form or the Baroque form, but really focusing on this arrangement of an interior church which promotes this liturgical idea, pilgrimage from initiation to the Eucharist. So we get some great examples of late liturgical movement style churches here in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. The first one, as we see here, my mission parish, Immaculate Heart of Mary in Calumet, Oklahoma. This was designed by Monsignor Don Keneally, who built it really as a small parish church. And it's got this beautiful alignment, right? It's very strong central axis leading straight to the altar. The altar was closer to the large crucifix there. And you can even see the tester, right? There's a tester that would have gone over the altar. So very much a very clear example of liturgical movement architecture. Later in the period, Immaculate Heart of Mary built in 1959. The next one, a crowd favorite, St. Patrick in Oklahoma City. also built by Monsignor Canelli in 1963. Again, a very strong sense of directionality. As you know, if you've been to St. Patrick, where's the baptismal font? It's behind you in that little small kind of claustrophobic little baptistry there. And you go then out into the kind of open air, this beautiful big space, the glass box inside of the concrete box, which holds very prominently the altar. And the eye is sort of arrested by that cinder block thing behind it, which Father Gallatin once said was like the Sistine Chapel. It also has a tester, a very kind of a very mid-century modern tester that's up there, all the very kind of spindly things that go down. And this, you can see this is a church that absolutely lives up to the mantra, all beauty is within. Because from without, there's not much there. A lot of concrete. Here's another example, though, maybe a nicer example. St. Joseph's Cathedral in Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford had an old cathedral that burnt down, and they built this church in the mid-century. I can't remember exactly when. I think early 60s, they built this church. Again, you can see there's a very prominent sense of the altar right in the middle. It's got this baldachin, the ciborium over the altar, and this huge image. It's like a mosaic. I can't remember exactly how it's made. Some sort of mosaic back there of Jesus. The joke about this cathedral, Hartford, I don't know if you know Hartford, but that's where most of the world's biggest insurance companies are. And so they said that Hartford finally got the cathedral it deserved, one that looks like a filing cabinet. And from the outside, it does. But from the inside, it is quite beautiful with all the stained glass, which are very bold colors. And again, it gives us very strong sense of directionality from the baptistry, from the baptismal font to the altar. So there are some beautiful examples there of liturgical, mid-century liturgical movement architecture. That's the first period. The second period that we're going to talk about, the conciliar period, we start with Annibale Bugnini, the Peritus of the Second Vatican Council, subsequent secretary of the Concilium for the instruction of the reforms of the Constitution on sacred liturgy. And he writes, the participation and active involvement of the people of God in the liturgical celebration is the ultimate goal of the reform, just as it was the goal of the liturgical movement. So we see a connection between what the liturgical movement was striving for and what the Second Vatican Council and Sacrosanctum Concilium strives for. Sacrosanctum Concilium, which writes, the fine arts are deservedly ranked among the noblest activities of human genius, and this applies especially to religious art and to its highest achievement, sacred art. So Second Vatican Council, Sacrosanctum Concilium didn't really dictate a lot about what should change within a church. It was after the council, immediately after the council, this group of consultants called the Concilium, which started implementing this document, Sacrosanctum Concilium. And in its first instruction, this Concilium, the first instruction, which is entitled Inter Ecumenici, it describes some very significant changes to practice in church architecture. It kind of gives instructions for things that before they weren't really instructed about, gives a lot more direction and puts just more emphasis on how to arrange the church and thus how you would build a church. So it calls first and foremost for a freestanding altar. And this was something that the liturgical movement was also striving for. The idea that the altar freestanding is more closely aligned to the image of the altar in the Old Testament and the fact that even in the Psalms, it speaks about walking around the altar of God, right? So the freestanding altar. And it says to permit walking around it and celebration facing the people. So we're not going to get into ad orientem in this discussion, but it certainly was the idea of the liturgical movement in the Second Vatican Council that it might be advantageous to celebrate Mass versus Populum. That draws attention to itself too. The idea that an altar separated and freestanding would draw attention to itself by its placement and craftsmanship. It also talks about, in Inter-Ecumeniki, the necessity of a chair for the celebrant and ministers. You think, well, didn't they always have that? Well, they did have a sedalia, but really, if you think about it, a lot of Mass before the Second Vatican Council, a lot of it was spent with the priest standing, right? The priest was doing stuff. So now there's a sense that the chair has to be a place that's given meaning, which is clearly visible to the faithful, but it does not resemble a throne. The main altar no longer, on the main altar, the candlesticks don't have to be on the altar, the cross need not be on top of it, but it may be placed next to it. In the tabernacle, this is a key thing, because the tabernacle really is the point of contention. We'll see it's the thing that drives everything else in the 60s. The tabernacle ought to remain on the main altar. So ought to remain on that main freestanding altar. But it may be reserved in another place, in particular cases approved by the local ordinary. So the idea at that time was that it would be the bishop who could say, well, you can move the altar or the tabernacle to a tabernacle stand somewhere off the altar. And even if you had a Mass celebrated towards the people, you could still have the tabernacle on the altar. And the idea was that they were starting to build tabernacles. You've seen these probably, that are only about yay high, right? And you could fit a small ciborium inside that little small tabernacle, so that you could celebrate Mass facing the people and yet still have a tabernacle on the altar. Talks about other minor altars that should be placed in chapels somewhat set apart from the body so as not to take the focus off the main altar. The faithful are to have places in the church to participate with both eyes and mind. And Inter-Ecumeniki also talks about arranging the choir and the organ and about the baptistry, right? The baptismal font and baptistry decorated and arranged so that it clearly expresses the dignity, the sacrament of baptism, and that it is a place well suited for communal celebrations. So a lot of this draws directly from the idea of the liturgical movement, making a liturgical church which emphasizes these elements, these important elements of our Catholic life, baptism, the Eucharist, so on and so forth, and the celebration of the Eucharist. So these instructions are also recapitulated in the third instruction by the Concilium, which is called Eucharisticum Mysterium. Oh, by the way, in the previous one, anybody know what this church is? This is a tough one. This is not in Oklahoma, I'm sorry. This also isn't in the United States, so it's a little bit of a... This is St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal. Montreal. A good example of a late, just like right after the 20th, or right after the council, what was built. Eucharistica Mysterium, which is this next instruction given by the Concilium, the third instruction, emphasizes the same things, a lot of the same things. It actually recapitulates everything that was given in Inter-Ecumeniki. But it does add some new instructions about the tabernacle, and this is where I'm saying, really in the 60s, this is what everything turns around. So Eucharistica Mysterium brings up two concerns: that the faithful are able to pray before the Blessed Sacrament unhindered. Does that sound good? Yeah? I think it does, right? Who doesn't love the Blessed Sacrament here? I mean, we're all Catholic, right? So, that's a concern. They want people to be able to pray before the Blessed Sacrament unhindered, and that the celebration of the Mass through which Christ becomes present in the Eucharist is not undermined in its sign value by the tabernacle being present on the altar before Mass begins. What? The idea that the Eucharistic presence of Jesus might be undermined by having a tabernacle on the altar before Mass begins, because temporally the moment of consecration hasn't happened yet. That's where Eucharistica Mysterium makes kind of a big recommendation, a big ask, and forces a big shift in how churches were built. The instruction then recommends a chapel where the Eucharist may be reserved in a tabernacle, on an altar, or elsewhere. And we have a good example of that here in this church. Anyone been to D.C.? This is the shrine, National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. has this very mid-century Blessed Sacrament Chapel. The tabernacle, as you know, is not there in that big main church. It's off to the side in this one of these, there's like 1 million chapels in that place, but this is one of them. And so this is a big deal, right? The previous 1917 Code of Canon Law stated that the tabernacle must be positioned in the center of the altar. It didn't specify which altar, but it was kind of understood that it would be in the main altar. And the first instruction, Inter Ecumenici, holds fast to that regulation. But the subsequent instruction, Eucharistica Mysterium, introduces a contradictory instruction. It emphasizes, yes, reserving the Blessed Sacrament in a chapel, in a place where people can pray, but separate from the main body of the church to allow for private worship. Now, one of the other controversies within this, and I know you're bored, you're like sick of this weed, like this is a weed that we're stuck in and we can't get out of it, but it is kind of a big weed. One of the things added to the confusion was that it suggests this, but then it describes in one of the paragraphs how the previous instructions should be upheld, right? What Inter Ecumenici said. And so it almost discards it. But then in the English translation, the numbers are switched up. And so in the English translation, there's an emphasis on this other thing, that we should put it in a chapel, right? So this is a little bit of I would say, a little bit of a botched step by the concilium here in writing Eucharistica Mysterium and its explanation of something heretofore unknown, right, in the church. First of all, this idea that in the liturgy, Christ is revealed by means of a temporal progression, first in the gathered assembly, and then the Word of God, and then in the moment of the consecration, Eucharistically, and then going forth from the Mass into the world, Christ is made present. And so there's a theologian, late 20th century, early 21st century theologian, Timothy Viverick, argues that Eucharistica Mysterium 55, which is this controversial paragraph, should not be interpreted as an authoritative liturgical theory, but as a practical recommendation against placing the tabernacle on a Mass altar. He opposes the notion that the four modes of presence are successively manifest during Mass. That's ridiculous to think that the modes of presence of Jesus in the Eucharistic assembly and the Mass happen successively. No, they happen all at the same time. So this is, though, what kind of gets brought into the second half of the 20th century, this controversy about really where the tabernacle should be. In the conciliar reforms, though, they must be read in, as Ratzinger describes, a hermeneutic of reform that promotes a continued vision of building and arranging churches which stand certainly as symbols of a heavenly Jerusalem and the holy dwelling of God. Here we have, an Oklahoma City example, St. Charles Borromeo, which I think we could argue is a good example of late 60s church architecture, which is built with this sense of continuity, like a hermeneutic of reform. You have a very strong altar, but the pews are arranged so that more people can kind of see more closely what's happening at the altar. The tabernacle is there, central. Now, I don't actually remember if the tabernacle was there when it was built. I'm pretty sure it was there when it was built, but it may have been since moved. And of course, there is the whole drama about there's a whole controversy about the cross. But if you're not from Oklahoma, you may not know that. If you are from Oklahoma, you do know that. And you can ask, if you're not from Oklahoma, you can ask your Oklahoma friends, why is there a controversy about the cross? So, that's kind of an example of late 20th century church, like right at the end of the council, that era, late 60s church architecture. Now, after the council, like significantly after the council, and after all the reforms kind of came out, the instructions came out, we have another, section, which is called the post-conciliar period, another era. And the post-conciliar period is where certainly everything goes off the rails, if you were to talk about what the vision of the liturgical movement thinkers was. Because in the United States, especially, there was a document published by the Bishops' Committee on the Liturgy entitled Environment and Art in Catholic Worship, EACW. And it aimed to provide principles for preparing liturgical spaces for Christian worship. And it was influenced by a few authors, Robert Hovda, who was an American liturgist, and very progressive, and Frank Kosmarczyk, who is himself a kind of a liturgical consultant and artist. So those are two big American names. Peter Hammond, who is English, who wrote the book Liturgy and Architecture, who argued for radical functionalism in church design, so building churches that are radically functional and nothing more. And then Architecture for Worship, which you see the book title there, which is by E.A. Sovic. And Sovic argues for a return to the non-church. So the idea, like before the Edict of Milan, when Christians were kind of huddled in homes, right? Return to a non-church, a building that's not really set apart for sacred use. So that's the influence in the 70s that comes up with this document, EACW, Environment and Art in Catholic Worship. And one of the most definitive and controversial claims of this document is this one. To speak of environment and artistic requirements in Catholic worship, we have to begin with ourselves. I don't know about you, but I don't think myself is a good place to start. We who are the church, the baptized, the initiated, among the symbols with which the liturgy deals, none is more important than this assembly of believers. See, the idea that there is a real shift in our understanding of what a church is, it's evident in this document, Environment and Art in Catholic Worship. And I think it's clearly inconsistent with Sacrosanctum Concilium, which itself speaks of things set apart for sacred worship, being symbolic, including, of course, the rites themselves. It never speaks about the assembly being a symbol, and it never considers the assembly certainly as being the primary symbol in the liturgy. And of course, what this causes is what we might call an anthropocentric shift. Who teaches English here? Anybody? Nobody? Anthropocentric. Human-centered, right? Man-centered. It's a shift that focuses on us. As the document it reads, it says, the building or cover enclosing the architectural space is a shelter or skin for a liturgical action. The idea that really the church building itself is nothing more than a skin doesn't leave much to work with or much of a desire to make it beautiful, really. So this anthropocentric shift, focusing on ourselves, here's a good example. St. John the Baptist in Edmond. Everything's sort of focused around the altar, but it's all focused around each other, right? Maybe that's not the best. That's a good place to put it. Somebody was just talking about St. John's. I felt like, gosh, I got to put St. John's in this PowerPoint. I think this is a good place. But what does this shift push us towards, right? What does this anthropocentric shift push us towards? Well, one thing is the removal of symbols, right? We remove symbols which are irrelevant to a worshiping community, including displays of artistry and even the tabernacle. Here's a really good example of this. I bet nobody knows where this is. Anybody? It's not in Oklahoma. It's not in Oklahoma. Oh, Grand Prairie, that would have been good. Yeah, no, it's not in Grand Prairie. This is St. Procopius Abbey, Benedictine Abbey, in Lisle, Illinois. So St. Procopius Abbey, which itself was very connected to the liturgical movement. So it's sort of later comes out of that liturgical movement ideal. But here you have a church which has nothing. It's like one big brick wall, you know. You can barely see it. There is actually a crucifix kind of hiding behind the baptismal candle, the Easter candle there. You have the ambo and the altar, which are prominent. You can see the chair faintly there. It is, of course, a monastic setting, so they actually have benches for the whole choir of monks. But the idea that all the other symbols that you could put in a church would compete, right? They would necessarily compete with that primary symbol, which is the worshiping assembly. So we got to remove those symbols. Here's an example from the Archdiocese, a former example, St. Thomas More in Norman, which is my home parish. Woo-woo! We got a few St. Thomas More people here. But this is, of course, the old church. Some of you maybe go to St. Thomas More and you're like, I don't know what this is. Well, this is Hypel Hall now, but it used to be the church, and this is where we used to have Mass. And you see in there, no symbols, right? There's a real emphasis on this beautiful redwood ceiling, but no symbols. And the Stations of the Cross were, I think, added. I mean, they were added in there, and they're very minimalistic. There's just the crosses, and there's the central crucifix. But really, it's very light on its symbolic use. And all the other art that was added in there was much later. Second consequence of this anthropocentric shift is flexibility. There's an emphasis on flexibility and a sense of impermanence in everything. Because the needs of the assembly are constantly changing, they must be met at all times. We have to be flexible in how the churches are arranged. This is an example. This actually isn't a Catholic example. It's a Lutheran church, but you can see all the chairs which are movable, which can be arranged in any number of ways. There's that big cross, which is just there, standing, and it can be removed. That whole predella, the whole stand on which the altar is, all that could be moved. The altar itself could be moved. And we built a lot of churches with movable altars, right, which is very much against the idea of the fixed altar, this place of permanence, and this kind of furnishing which held the center of the church. So because the needs of the assembly, which is again that primary symbol, must be met, there's an emphasis here on flexibility and impermanence. Last, because different people find different styles and images beautiful or less beautiful, Environment and Art Catholic Worship rejects formal standards of beauty, rejects any sense of the scholastic idea of what beauty is, which had kind of objective standards. It rejects that and prefers churches to exhibit a numinous quality. Numinous, which itself really has no definition. It just, for some reason, it's beautiful, and you can't really say why. So you get churches that kind of look like this, right? This is a church in Germany. I don't know what church it is, but clearly it's very asymmetrical, very light, no real artistic qualities other than the curves and stuff like that, which, yes, is maybe numinous in its beauty, but it's not very well ordered. And it doesn't exhibit any of those classic ideas of beauty. So you get beauty as numinous. In the Archdiocese, I do have an example here. Maybe Elk City, St. Matthew and Elk City, very asymmetrical style church. And I don't know, maybe it's not even numinously beautiful. So in the end, all these conclusions are supported by a foundational premise, this premise that I stated before, that the symbols that were kind of previously known are inherently competitive. And that's undeniably present in the bishop's document, Environment and Art in Catholic Worship. It wants to build a functional space which does not pretend to be, and therefore cannot really symbolize anything other than a meeting place of the faithful, not really a house of God or a house for the church. What are we left with? Where do we go from here? That's a nice church. So at the beginning of a new millennium, the bishops in the United States did release a new document called Built of Living Stones, which was a great improvement over environment in our Catholic worship, describing kind of a greater sense of beauty, emphasizing, of course, building churches that are useful for the liturgy and themselves symbolize a liturgical pattern of life. But also we have the example of Pope Benedict XVI, right? In his work, Spirit of the Liturgy, Cardinal Ratzinger reasserts the power of orientation and beauty in sacred architecture, which can imprint on the Christian imagination a vision of our telos, that is, eschatological glory. So we have those two kind of works. There's some other works too, which are helpful. And then I think we can all agree that church architecture is getting better, right, in the 21st century. Here's a great example. Westminster Rothar Shrine. Not to toot our own horn, but we did a pretty good job, I feel like. It's beautiful, right? It's well ordered. It has a real sense of kind of direction or orientation to it. And it's very effective and useful for the liturgical rites, especially the modern liturgical rites. So, in the end, every age of the church is tasked with this challenge, right, of relating to the world, of imagining our heavenly reality and making that an earthly reality in the church building. And so the work of forming and reforming the Christian imagination doesn't really reach a completion point, They didn't reach it in the 12th century. They didn't reach it in the 15th century. They didn't reach it in the 19th century. And we still haven't reached it in the 21st century. It always requires inspiration, which is at the heart of all Christian art. So as the 21st century proceeds, sacred architects will have to take up the responsibility of speaking to the world through their medium, inspiring the church to imagine the heavenly Jerusalem in particularly beautiful ways. Certainly I think that via pulchritudine is important. Beautiful ways in conformity with liturgical law. And in doing so, they fulfill their mission to put man into possession of his eternal home, that is, heaven. And that is the end of my presentation. So, 50 minutes. Anyone bored yet? Any questions?
What would St. Damian's be one?
St. Damian's is a good question. I will say I've never physically been to St. Damian's in Oklahoma City. I do know St. Damian's was wasn't it a mortuary? Was it a funeral home before? Anybody know? I think it was a funeral home. So it was kind of built in a very nondescript style. And then they furnished it with some very nice furnishings, very important and beautiful furnishings, which certainly elevate it. So hopefully that helps you. Okay, and it also tailors to certainly a different set of rites, right? The traditional Latin rites. So that also plays a difference. Whenever the rites were reformed, that actually that affected a big shift in how we built churches. Sanctuaries ended up becoming a lot bigger, some to the detriment of that. Some are like way too big, but sometimes bigger is better. Sometimes it's not. So anyway, hopefully that answers your question. Yes?
What would you say is the role of an architecture in aiding worship of God?
Yeah, I think it's huge. I think the role in architecture is huge in the act of worship because it, as a sacred building, right, it sets us apart in our act of worship. And so the art that's used in sacred architecture, and of course, all of architecture is a work of art, as the liturgical movement authors said, needs to be inspired so that it does allow the Holy Spirit to work in those who are gathered there, so that it really can be fit to be set apart for the sake of worship. And I think it inspires a sense of wonder, awe, and joy. All liturgical architecture should contain three primary dimensions, right? There's a cosmological dimension, the cosmos, God's creation, which is ordered and beautiful. It should contain a doxological dimension. It should contain elements which give glory to God and inspire man to do so as well. And then it should contain eschatological elements that point to our eternal home in heaven and which draw us to that. So that's what I would say, those are key things to keep in mind whenever designing or considering designing a church building. We didn't really get there. I like that, yeah. Trying to go in a good direction. We didn't quite get there.
So then now, what would be like an assurity of knowing like, okay, actually we're heading in the better direction? You know, because
Yeah.
like, then we thought like this is the direction to go.
Right, yeah. Well, I think holding to timeless truths is certainly a key to that, right? So what we understand the church to be, what we understand man to be, mankind to be, and really, which all of that is very well articulated actually in the documents of the Second Vatican Council. So it's not a question, I would say, necessarily of we ended up, going in the wrong direction from what the church taught, but certainly there were leaders in the church, and I would say a misunderstanding or a misreception of what the Second Vatican Council gave the church, not just in architecture, not just in liturgy, but in a wide breadth. And we are, I feel like, back in a place where we've held closer to those timeless truths, which really direct our understanding of who we are as God's creation, as human beings, and who we are together collectively as the faithful, as the church, and what we're called to do, to love, to know, to love, and to serve God. So that's what I would say. Yeah, but like I said, the work doesn't end, right? It doesn't come to a completion point. So even though we imagine something, in 2020, it may not speak to a different generation. I mean, hopefully that's, I think, the goal of liturgical architecture is that it is timeless, right? And I think we can say that there are definitely some examples of liturgical architecture that are timeless. But it really does require that they be inspired, right? Inspired works of art, which speak to a culture and a people. That was one of the things that the liturgical movement really wanted was, especially in use of materials, using materials which were meaningful to a culture, to a people who are nearby. And that's the case in Oklahoma. There's a lot of materials that were used, like in that church I showed in Calumet. All those stones were from that area, So that speaks to the people. It itself symbolizes that people who are gathered together. So yeah, it's a little bit of a balancing act, I would say. And how do you speak to somebody? Who do you speak to? And making it still timeless and able to go across generations. So, long answer, short question. Good. Yes.
When you're approving a building through the building committee for the Archdiocese, is there a list? Is there a code that you go through that it has to follow, or is there
That's a great question. No, there's not really. That's a great question. It's a great idea. You want to work on that for me? No, it's a great idea. I mean, we have people on building committee who are through all kinds of dimensions of building, right? So architects, but also civil engineer. We have mechanical engineers and stuff like that. Construction people and all that stuff. So certainly we use the codes that are dictated by the state. And then, of course, the codes, which are liturgical codes, quote unquote, what we read in the general instruction of the Roman Missal, and what's required by the Catholic Church, Code of Canon Law, and so on and so forth. But yeah, we don't have any rubric of our own, unfortunately, that we use as a standard. I do know of dioceses that do. I do know of dioceses like Phoenix. I knew at one point they had a really strict, and then they ended up with a bunch of churches that all looked the same, which was fine, I guess. But they did kind of all end up looking exactly the same, you know. So anyway, yeah, you got to follow the money there, because actually classical style is relatively inexpensive, you know. What's really expensive is a super modern church, like the Church of Christ Our Light in Oakland, which cost like $150 million. Whereas the Blessed Rother Shrine didn't cost a third of that, you know? So classical styles don't cost as much money because they make sense, right? You have things that lay on things. You have things that lay on things which hit the ground, and they support the things that are trying to, you know, make the building. So what's prohibitive, you got to follow the money. You got to follow architects who want to make money off of a $150 million building as opposed to a $50 million building. That's why it's, I think, not as attractive. Yeah.
One more question.
Yes, Ashton.
Why does architecture matter in the worship of God?
Another great question, yeah. I would say all art matters in the worship of God because it's part of our participation in God's work, right? So any art is a participation in creation. And so whenever we build churches, or whenever we make works of art, as human beings, we participate in God's work. And so that's why it's important that we do our best to make works of art that are beautiful and which communicate the truth about God's creation. And so that helps us to worship. So there you go. Okay, well, sounds like time. Thank you. Thank you all.